as you know, we are facing once again, and it seems to be the case all the time, another budget issue. And what we wanted to do, and you all know that the governor has proposed a 20% cut. We are advocating in Harrisburg to change that, all those things. What we want to do is to share with you what the numbers are as of now, the things that we know, and also give you an idea of some potential numbers depending on some changes and things that may happen. One of the figures that I think is important to keep in mind is that all these, and they want to be talking about it in detail, all these figures are based on current flat enrollment, assuming that enrollment doesn't grow at all. And every 100 students that we grow, or that we lose, is about $700,000 in revenue. So obviously, I want to look at the admissions people. See, that is is a very important thing to keep our enrollment. And actually, last year, we had a loss of enrollment. We lost a little bit of students. And if we can go back to the level that we had 2 years ago, that would be a really good thing for us. It would be the same level we had before, and it would certainly help a little bit. As I said, it's $700,000 per every 100 students that we have. These projections, and they're going to be talking about it in more detail because they are the numbers people, gloom and almost doom. Last year, when we were doing these presentations, we had a Ken Stewart doing that with Ken Long, and so it was Ken, and I call them Ken Square, but they were better known as gloom and doom on the campus. So now it's Matt doing this. But these projections really incorporate only the collective bargaining agreement changes that have been agreed upon, meaning the AFSCME contract. So those numbers we know, and they are there. For the other unions on campus that have not settled the contracts, basically APSCOF and SCUPA, we have put in a 0 as part of the budget projection. It doesn't mean that it is a 0. It's not a bargaining projection at all. It has nothing to do with that. It is just that we don't know. So we couldn't put any number other than 0 for those projections. Again, I know that that is something that will be a question that you may have, so I am anticipating that that will be one of the questions in there. Once the contracts gets settled, both contracts, we will have we'll have an idea of, we will know exactly what it will be. We don't know when that is going to happen, so until that happens, we just have to continue waiting for the bargaining table conversation to move forward. So in the meantime, we'll continue to project that as a 0 level for increases, meaning, again, just because we don't know. The way that we're going to be doing it this morning is that Ken and Matt can have a presentation with numbers and things for the budget, and after that, we will just have an open question and answer period. And in addition to Ken and Matt, Dr. Vargas is here, Carlos is here, and Jerry Silverman is here. So, and John Green is here, and I saw Elsa here. So all cabinet is here. So yeah, of course, he's right in front, my boss. So all cabinet is here, so we can all have any kind of question and answer about anything that you are interested in related to the budget. All right? And with that, I'm going to turn it to Ken.
Good morning, everyone. As Dr. Cevallos indicated, we're going to give you a kind of a quick preview of what we're doing in the business and financial service area in terms of the budget, going through some of the outlines and some of the projections that we put together based on information we have from both Harrisburg as well as some assumptions we put in it from campus experience. These are not exact numbers. We're still fine-tuning the numbers, and as you'll see through the presentation, they'll constantly, it's an evolving process, a more organic process, and we won't really know the final outcome until some things are settled in Harrisburg and by the Board of Governors. With that said, most of you may remember in past years, over the past 2 years, we've presented major budget factors. These are the items that drive the budget, one way or the other, good or bad, and we're going to outline those. Really, nothing has changed in the past 2 years in terms of what are our major budget factors. The only thing you would see that's missing is utilities. In previous years, utilities was a major factor for us. It's still a significant factor, but we have better controls, better information. The facility folks have done a great job in keeping costs down and controlled. So we've taken that off the list of one of the major factors. It's still significant, but it's not a major factor that's going to drive the budget one way or the other. And we can thank the facility guys for for taking care of that or helping us out on that side. We broke it down in 3 areas this time: the revenue factors, enrollment, tuition rate, appropriation, and the expenditure factors: employee salaries, retirement benefits, healthcare benefits. As you notice, the expenditure factors all relate to employee and personnel, and that's just because they are the major items that are driving the budget from an expense standpoint. Enrollment. Of the major factors, the revenue factors, enrollment is the only one we somewhat control. As Dr. Cevallos indicated, we're down this year compared to prior year in enrollment, and that's something we have some influence on. Not exactly, but we do have somewhat control over that in terms of how many students we bring in, retention efforts, graduation, so on and so forth. So we do have a little bit of influence on this one, and this is probably the only one we have enough influence to make an impact on a budget. For every 1% change in enrollment, approximately 100 students, we're looking at about a $700,000 change in revenue. As Dr. Cevallos also indicated, plus or minus 1% could make a difference. Doesn't sound like a lot when you're looking at 1%, but then when you translate it to the number of students, approximately 100 students, that will have an impact on the revenue line. You'll notice on all the slides, we've indicated what a 1% change represents. That's basically to provide you with information so you can, if you hear news, it changed by 3%, something changed by 2%, you can quickly calculate the impact that it will have on the budget, and it's not as complicated as it sounds. State appropriation. This one has probably got the most news in recent time. The governor proposed a 20% cut in appropriation to the state system. We have a formula for appropriation that's given by the chancellor's office. That 20% change would represent about $7.3 million for KU. This is not a system number that was given to us. It's a number we calculated based on a formula that we've used in past years. Can that formula change a little bit? Yes, it can change, but it won't be anything significant. We're still looking at, if the governor's proposal holds, a $7 million reduction in revenue that needs to be made up. Every 1% change in state appropriation represents about $360,000, $370,000. So you can see the magnitude of each 1% in state appropriation, and we'll talk a little more about what we're thinking. Tuition rate. Tuition rate is not set by the institution. It's set by the Board of Governors. And typically, that's not going to occur until June. I think it's a June 27th, 28th Board of Governors meeting. So we really won't know what the tuition rate is. But if you recall, last year we had an unprecedented 7.5% increase in the tuition rate. Typically, we're looking at a 3 to 4% tuition rate increase, usually around inflation. So last year was unusually high to correspond with the 18% cut in state appropriation that we received last year. And, again, we don't know, we won't know what the Board of Governors will do until that June 27th meeting. For each 1% change in tuition rate is another $760,000. So you can get the magnitude of how just 1% of each one of these factors represent a large amount of revenue for us. On the expense side, as the President indicated, contracts are still open for SCUPA as well as APSCA. The ones that are, I think, ratified are ASME and the police, I believe, are ratified. So those are ratified, but 2 big ones still out there, APSCA and SCUPA are still. And the nurses. And the nurses, yes, that's still also open as well. So we do have some significant numbers out there that we just don't know. A 1% change in salary represents about a $600,000 change for us. So we have $700 in revenue for 2 of the items for 1% change. We got $600,000 for 1% change in expense items. Numbers don't look good. Am I doom or gloom now? I don't know who it is. Retirement, closely tied to salaries. Retirement benefits, in past years, I think about 2 years ago, we were concerned about skyrocketing retirement costs. There was a fee cap put in place for retirement where it wouldn't go up more than 3.5%. That's legislative put in place to cap it, but those caps still represent large increases because the rates previous to this was very low. For example, CSRS may have been 5%, or PSRS 5.6%. It's going up to 8, 9%. So while it's only going up 3.5%, it still represents a 70, 80% jump in the overall rate. And that's applied against the salaries that we pay. Matt will talk a little more in detail about how the numbers calculate, but a 1% change in the retirement cost represents about a $48,000 to $50,000 impact to us in expenses. So that's something we still have to monitor. That's something that's there. And again, Matt will speak a little more in detail about the exact numbers that we're looking at for this budget. Healthcare, very much like retirement. It's still going up 7 to 10% annually for us. The ASME contract has been ratified. That one was a lot lower than what we still are anticipating. That number is coming in about 4 to 5% increase on the ASME contract. But for all the other areas, all the other groups on campus, we're still looking at a 7 to 10% increase annually in the healthcare costs. Every 1% change represents $140,000 impact in terms of expenses. Matt is going to speak a little bit about the budget development process and walk us through some of the assumptions that we've made in this process.
As Ken mentioned, I'll walk through some of the preliminary assumptions that we're using for the 6 major budget factors that Ken just kind of walked through. I'll also share a few of the budget scenarios that we're looking at, and with those scenarios kind of show you what the budget deficit would be with each of them. And then finally, we'll also kind of look at the most likely scenario that we've selected to move forward with at this point. Basically, we had to choose one scenario for planning purposes, so we kind of have a target and something that we can all kind of start to move forward. So the factors on this slide you can see are down the left-hand side. We'll start with enrollment. As the president mentioned when he opened, at this point we're projecting flat enrollment. So right now in fiscal year 11-12, we are down, I believe, over about 2% from last year. So projecting from this year to 12-13, we're projecting that to be flat. So it really is at this point down from 2 years ago, but flat from the current year. The second factor being state appropriation. As Ken mentioned, the governor's budget currently includes a reduction of about 20%. We're going forward with a slightly more optimistic estimate, reduction of about 15%. Again, this is a KU-specific assumption, isn't any direction we've received from the state or from the chancellor's office. A 15% reduction in a state appropriation for the university would be about $5.5 million. So that's really one of the bigger factors that we're facing. Tuition rate. At this point, we're going with an assumption of a 5% increase. As Ken mentioned, historically, we've received 3 to 4% increases. Last year, or this current year, we're fortunate enough to receive a 7.5% increase, but we don't necessarily see that coming again. So using a slightly less of a reduction to appropriation and a slightly less of an increase to tuition of 5% versus the current year. The 5% increase results in about $3.8 million in additional revenue. So that would be a good increase there. As far as the expense factors, salaries, again, the challenge we're facing with salaries is the contracts aren't settled at this point. So the only assumption that we're using really is the increase for the ASME contract. The fiscal year impact of that contract would be an increase of 1.57%. That's because the timing of the step increase, I believe, is April 1st, 2013, so you don't see the full impact of that. So the annual impact for ASME would be 1.57%. And then for all the other bargaining units and management, we're currently using a 0% increase for salary. Retirement cost. The retirement cost specifically for Kutztown University, we're using an assumption of 17.1%. And that's basically a blended average because we have 3 different retirement plans at the university. As many of you know, we have the SERS plan, the PSERS plan, and the alternative retirement plan, which essentially would be your TIA-CREF type plan. The TIA-CREF plan, about 50% of our employees at the university are in that plan. That plan is where the university contributes 9.29% of your salary into your retirement. That plan isn't changing, so we're not realizing any additional expenses because of that plan. As Ken mentioned, the SERS and the PSERS plans are increasing significantly. They increased significantly this current year, and we're projecting them to increase about 40 to 50% again in 12-13. So 50% of our employees are in that plan that could increase 40 to 50%. So when you blend all the averages together, it comes out to about a 17% increase university-wide for retirement costs. That's about $825,000. So that is also a significant change that we're building into the budget. And the final factor is healthcare costs. We're currently using an assumption of 7.8% for APSCUF and management. That again could change depending on the negotiations on the contract. So that is our current assumption, our current estimate. We have 10% in for annuitants, 0% increase for ASME and SCUPA. Again, when you kind of blend all those rates together with the different type of employees here we have by bargaining unit, university-wide it would be a 5.4% increase in healthcare costs. That would result in about $770,000 in additional expense for the university. This next slide kind of gives you an idea of a few different budget scenarios. The first column on the far left, this is essentially before we even start to make any assumptions about state appropriation or tuition rate increases. So before we even look at those factors, when you take into account the $1.6 million increase in retirement and health care combined, the ASME contract as well as new employees, the salary impact of those changes, then we're already looking essentially at a $3 million hole going into 12-13 before we even have a state appropriation cut or we make an assumption on the tuition rate increase. The 3 scenarios that we kind of put up here, the first one being if the governor were to actually cut our budget by 20% and if we were to receive a 4% tuition increase, we would have a deficit of about $7.8 million. The second scenario, the slightly more optimistic view of a 15% cut by the governor and a 5% tuition increase would result in about $5.2 million deficit. And then finally, if the governor were to fully enact his budget plan, cut our budget by 20%, and we were to receive a tuition increase similar to the current year of 7.5%, that too would result in about a $5.2 million deficit. So those are basically 3 scenarios that we have kind of thrown up here just to kind of show you the impact of those potential changes. We also wanted to kind of share with you how our budget breaks out by division to kind of give you an idea of how that $122 million is spread through the university. About $78 million or 64% of our budget is in academic and student affairs. Administration and finance is about $17 million or 14% of that budget. Marketing and communications about 5%. Executive management and social equity combined for about 2%. And then you see that large chunk at the bottom is basically general university expenses kind of outside of any one division. That includes $3.6 million in instructional technology fees, $3.5 million in waiver expenses. It's also where we cover the costs for our debt payments on our buildings. It includes some costs for deferred maintenance and $1 million for strategic initiatives that we've also set aside. And then basically, as I mentioned, for planning purposes, we had to basically choose one of those scenarios so that we basically had something to move forward on and start to address. So we've gone with the 15% cut to appropriation, the 5% tuition rate increase, and the deficit of about $5.2 million. We have presented this to Cabinet, I believe, about 2 months ago. And at that point, we basically asked Cabinet to look at their divisions and try and come up with budget reductions or target reductions of about 7%. Now, 7% reductions across the university would give us about $8.5 million of potential things that we could look at cutting. So that would be above what our assumptions result in, the $5.2 million, but it would give us some wiggle room if the governor were to cut the budget by 20%, if we were only to get a 3% increase in tuition, et cetera. So it gives us a little extra money there, some additional options. We can prioritize the reductions and then make decisions as needed when we kind of get to the final number in the June timeframe.
All right. Thanks again for taking the time, and we will, if we hear anything new in terms of budget, I will be putting out emails to you or whatever, and please do not hesitate to email me or call me if you have any question, any issue that you want to talk about, okay? So thank you.